Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I want to introduce my partner today, who, as Paul said, is the Reverend Kristin Miles from Trinity Church, Wall Street. Kristin is the Director of Pastoral Care and Community at Trinity Church. She is also a board-certified chaplain and spent how many years at Yale? 3 years at Yale New Haven Children's Hospital. So she has an enormous amount of experience in trauma and how trauma works. And we're really grateful to have you here. So the first thing I'd like to do is just say a little bit about the subject of trauma. You think you can do that? There we go. I'd like to begin. We want to have a kind of starting point for our conversation today and begin with just a definition of trauma. So we're defining trauma as an experience of threatened bodily or psychic annihilation, which floods all the normal coping mechanisms and is recorded in the brain in fragments, traces, and bruises that change the neural pathways in the brain. So this is one of the really important pieces about trauma, and we know this clinically, is that the brain gets changed. And much of the work around trauma is around understanding how as clinicians and then how as pastoral caregivers we think about that change in the brain. The fragments that I just spoke of, and this is very characteristic of trauma, they are experienced in separate domains. So that those domains might be emotional reactivity, cognitive perception or distortion. It's not at all uncommon for there to be a kind of distorted cognitive experience, bodily sensations, and behavioral repetition. Freud talked about the behavioral repetition. That is the kind of desire for mastery. You know, I'm going to do it again, and then when I do it again, I'm going to get it right this time, and I'm going to defeat the trauma. And that's why very often, you know, you may see people who are repeating risky risky behaviors that put themselves in danger again, whether that's in danger of being raped again, whether that's in danger of yet again marrying the substance abusing spouse, yet again doing X, Y, or Z, which from the person who's not living in a traumatized reality, stepping back from it would say, and you're doing that, why? But for the traumatized person, there is a disconnect between the repetition, the cognition, the emotional reactivity, and that's why for the family members, for the friends, sometimes for the clinician, there's a kind of, say what? But from a trauma perspective, it is entirely understandable. This is how stress works in terms of the autonomic nervous system. Two features of the autonomic nervous system. One is the sympathetic and the other is the parasympathetic. And people who are traumatized can get caught in either. So if they're caught in the sympathetic nervous system response, they are full of arousal, they are full of hypervigilance, they are full of startle responses. It's as if their baseline, it's not as if, it is that their baseline of functioning has gone up to here. So now their baseline is up here. And so they have nightmares, they have arousal reactions, they're very touchy, they're very quick to some kind of emotional reactivity. That's when, you know, it's as if the stress response leaves them stuck on. The opposite of that is the parasympathetic nervous system. And by the way, just to let you know, all of these slides will be available on our website, so you're free to access that as you wish. The parasympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system leaves the person's traumatic response stuck on off. And when that happens, you have a person who is numb. Sometimes it's been called la belle indifference. So you may see, and I don't know, Kristin, in your experience in the hospital, or for that matter in pastoral work, what you've experienced, but you may see a person who seems indifferent. You know, that they really don't seem concerned. Some people misinterpret this, they think they don't care, they didn't love the loved one, etc., etc. A good rule of thumb is never judge. Suspend all judgment. Because what this person is doing is trying to maintain a certain degree of homeostatic balance. I don't know if you want to comment on that or have any experience in, or do you want to wait on that? Okay. So that's just a brief word about how trauma operates.
I can comment a little bit about that especially working with families, there can be a lot of frustration of, especially when the shutdown mode of this person just has no energy, won't take any initiative, I have all these good suggestions, won't follow. So I feel that in terms of, I see that more often, I think, with in my experience with family members who are struggling with this situation.
I see. So, yeah, you're talking about the family who's looking on.
Yes.
And
or just how misunderstood this is.
Yes, yes, how misunderstood. And how much the family can create a narrative about this is what this numbness means, when clinically, psychologically, psychiatrically, this is not what this numbness means. So one of the things that Kristin and I thought we would do is to, I wanted to share with you some experiences that I had a couple of weeks ago in San Antonio. I went down with a group of volunteers to work with migrant families who are crossing the border. And I worked with a nonprofit organization called American Gateways. And this is a group that provides legal assistance to migrants crossing the border. And I guess the first thing I wanted to say is, first of all, in terms of trauma, there's individual trauma, which is what this represents. But there's also structural trauma and systemic trauma and trauma that is in the collective. And so I think that when we talk about migrants crossing the border and the people who in fact are on those border towns, we're talking also about a collective trauma. So the first thing I want to say about my experience is to confirm for you what you already know, that there is a crisis at the border, and the crisis is a humanitarian crisis. It's a crisis born of poverty and gang-related threats, gender-based violence, and escalating climate change in the Northern Triangle, which is El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and parts of northern Mexico. Many of those areas, these are agricultural people to a large extent in these areas, and their ability to continue to grow food and have crops is severely diminished because of climate change. I would also like to say that I'm not by any means any kind of an expert on immigration. I know it's very, very complex. I certainly understand that we need comprehensive immigration reform. But what we know is that people have a right, a legal right, to seek asylum and they have a legal right to a hearing. We learned yesterday in the news that within 90 days there is going to be an application fee applied to asylum seekers who are seeking asylum. We also learned that these people will not be able to obtain work permits, so that while they're awaiting their hearing, which may take months or years, they will be unable to work. So there's a tremendous difficulty that these people are having in terms of trying to actually achieve what is in our country a legal right. I want to talk about a few stories and ask Kristin for her thoughts on it from a Christian perspective. We worked at a place called the San Antonio Resource Center. Now the San Antonio Resource Center is a room, and it's about the size, it's this room and half more. So in case you think it's like a big deal, I think the sign shows you it's been in existence for 3 weeks, and it's designed to immediately respond to those people who have crossed the border, then put on a bus and land in San Antonio, which is a couple of hours away. I spoke with a number of people in the resource center, and one of them is a woman whom I'll call Maria, and she is from Honduras, and she had just crossed the Rio Grande 2 days before with her 16-year-old daughter. And she is from a city in Honduras called San Pedro Sula. So for any of you who might know anything about Honduras, this is one of the most dangerous cities in the country. And Honduras is a country that has the most homicides of any country that is not currently at war. So Honduras is an enormously dangerous country, and it is particularly dangerous for girls and women. This is a graph that gives you an idea about gender-based violence in Honduras. And this shows only until 2013. And in recent years, the extent of gender-based violence against women and girls has increased by 390%. So you have Maria and her 16-year-old daughter, seeking some kind of relief from this kind of violence. So we talked about this. We talked about women and girls and gender. Wonder if you could comment about what does Christianity have to say, or how do we think about it?
I think I want to start with a segue, Mary, the question about is there anything different in the way you view the concept of trauma, and then link it to women. Just because in the Christian tradition, the religion actually was born out of a trauma, really, and that in the Christian understanding, God was incarnate in the person of Jesus and came and lived among us and worked and did ministry and was here to make accessible this mercy of God, to put it in human form, and was crucified as a result of what he did to challenge structures, especially in the Roman Empire. And so the tradition itself is born out of an understanding of trauma and the understanding that there's a responsibility for us to, as a faith community, as all people, to take very seriously that we don't transmit trauma and structures of trauma. That the idea of Jesus was the one who absorbed this desperation and violence and didn't pass it on. And that's really what we are all called to do, is to access that ability to be in places of domination and oppression and work to change that and do whatever we can not to pass it on. And so I want to say that there is certainly a mea culpa in the Christian tradition for the ways that the religious structure itself has transmitted this, has not followed the model of Jesus in terms of alleviating trauma, and especially with women. I think that just needs to be stated, that as much as the Christian tradition has such beauty and potential for transformation there has been within its structures of oppression of women. So it's a serious consideration in Christianity, in the hierarchical structures that we've had.
I'm also thinking what you're saying. It's global.
Yeah.
That kind of oppression of women, whether within the faith communities or not, it's a global phenomenon about how women are treated.
So there is that, just kind of owning the problematic areas of our faith, and there's also the, as I said, the greater call to all of us as Christians and spiritual seekers to make sure that we do the work to support, nurture, and embrace those who are being marginalized and oppressed. And I think in Christianity especially, Jesus models the ways that in his time women were considered lesser than, disposable, and makes a statement of saying no, that actually these are among my closest followers, and makes a statement of embrace and protection. So that's kind of the tension that we have in Christianity. I think Mary was going to talk a little bit about, in hearing the stories of Maria. A very important part of Christianity is listening to story and narrative. And actually the telling of the story is very important, and that's a gift that we take seriously for people who are traumatized, is that their story matters, and all stories matter. And also, a community is there to hear stories and witness. I think an important part of this for Christians is that, and women, is that there's a great story of Jesus meeting someone who is blind and asking them, not assuming what they need, with Bartimaeus, saying, "What is it that you need?" And I think in terms of the Christian tradition, having that humility to say, what is your story, and let me not make an assumption about what you need or where you've been, but you inform it and you claim it. And I think a problem right now we're having is that there is such assumptions made about people who are trying to come into our country and seek sanctuary. There's just a global assumption about the women, and there's not that curiosity and willingness to hear and have compassion for the individual experiences like Maria.
Just to follow up on what Kristin just said, one of the things that happens in trauma is that the narrative is shattered. So a person that's what I was trying to point out with the affective domain, the cognitive domain, the behavioral domain. It's not integrated, it's shattered. And so when that is shattered, the clinical work is the putting the story back together. The clinical work is what happened. And
I think the ritual work and tradition is the gift of spiritual traditions is ritual as a container. So that even when the narrative is shattered, you are held in a container of ritual that you participate with other people, and you are part of something bigger. So I think ritual can be helpful in containing for people in trauma.
right. That's, I think, so important, the role of ritual. To another story, let me just pose this to you. I want you to imagine that you're taking a bus from San Antonio to Far Rockaway, Queens, believe it or not. That you'll travel for 3 days, that you'll have 16 stops, change buses 4 times, and you don't know the language. So this is Nelson from Guatemala with his 10-year-old son. And I have a little bit of Spanish, but it's so rudimentary that you wouldn't want to know. But it was actually in a paradoxical kind of way, a nice shift of the power imbalance. Because guess who was the one who was stumbling and having trouble and not having the right word and getting it wrong? That was a shift of the power imbalance, and a good one. My role with Nelson in the Resource Center was to help him understand his bus ticket. And so here was my work. with the bus ticket. This was to show what city he was leaving from, what city he was arriving at, how long the layover would be, when the bus changes. And of course I couldn't explain it to him. I could only do it. And then a colleague of mine who is fluent in Spanish explained it to him. And you'll notice that this slide ends in Richmond, Virginia. And I thought I had finished my work. And I said to her, would you please explain to him his bus, where he's going, what the layover is. And she turned over the bus ticket and said, Mary, he's going to Far Rockaway, Queens. So even at this, I didn't get it quite right. But after Richmond, Virginia, he had Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia, and Newark, and Penn Station, and then on to Queens Village. So I just want you to know, first of all, it was actually quite difficult to figure out this bus ticket. I don't know what experience you have with bus tickets that have 16 stops, but they're really hard to figure out. And I found myself feeling nervous. Because I thought, well, the stakes are sort of high. I have to get it right. And then I thought to myself, what would he be feeling? What would he be feeling? Also with a 10-year-old son. And then I thought about the untold number of children who've been separated from their parents. Maybe 2,300, maybe more than that. How many of them have been reunited? Where are they? How many parents are in the country of origin, having already been deported, with children in the United States? What is the long-term traumatic effect of separation from parents? I want to quote Judith Lewis Herman in her seminal book called Trauma and Recovery. The knowledge of horrible events periodically intrudes into public awareness, but it is rarely retained for long. Denial, repression, and dissociation operate on a social as well as an individual level. So, separation of children from parents was in the news, but I don't know if it still is. But the experience goes on.
In the Christian tradition, certainly there is a understanding. There's a beautiful story of Jesus welcoming the children and saying, each child is precious. We must take responsibility, and there's a specificity in this. And I think what we're seeing is as kind of dissociation societally. It's just too overwhelming to think about the way that how many children are being traumatized by what we're doing. So we kind of we don't get specific. We kind of generalize, or we forget. We dissociate as a culture. And I think one of the things our Christian tradition offers is the ability. I really, Mary's question about. I really wondered what was Nelson feeling. What was his son feeling? And that question, that curiosity, the sitting with this. And I think of there's a Roman Catholic nun, Ruth Burroughs, in England, and she wrote a book about faith for Lent. And there was a great line in an interview with her. And she says, in the Gospels, Jesus says, "Be not afraid." When we think about it, he is the only one able to say this with authority, for he is the answer to all our fears. And I love that, in that whether or not we agree that is true for us, the way she says that we can say to people, we kind of can dismiss, or when it comes to trauma, and we can say, a simple, it'll work out, or not people who are trained, but I think culturally, don't be afraid, it'll work out, or there are ways that we speak words of comfort. And really no one should be saying this. We need to really enter into the reality that is complex and uncertain and messy and not resolvable, and sit with that. And I think that is one thing that our faith calls us to and gives us access to.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about that whole question of what not to say. Like, it'll all be fine.
Yes.
It will all be fine. It's not fine. It's not fine. And we know that clinically. that it's a fine line to walk, isn't it? Between hope and despair, I think. It's a fine line to walk where you are not superficially reassuring someone who is desperate and at the same time not deepening their despair. I don't like have an answer for that one, but it does feel like a very, very fine line, both pastorally and clinically. And it may even be more important pastorally because, religious leaders sometimes feel that they must reassure or they must provide a religious answer. Clinicians feel that too, by the way. The answer is somewhere in the DSM-5. It's just a matter of finding it. One more story. Besides being at the Resource Center, and also we spent time in immigration court in San Antonio, the other place we went was the Piersall Detention Center, which is, the official name is the South Texas Detention Center. And this is a very large for-profit prison with barbed wire all around it, with cinder blocks everywhere. And it is filled mostly with men and some women. And so here are some of the statistics about the Piersall Center. It's got 1,700 men and some women, for profit. I found this interesting. The detainees wear jumpsuits depending on their alleged criminal histories. So if you're good to go, you're in blue. And if you have a minor offense, you're in orange. And if you have some kind of alleged aggravated offense, you're in red. So when people come into the room where we were helping them to fill out asylum applications, you immediately have a sense, by color, of who the bad guys are, in quotes. So I was thinking of the Scarlet Letter. That's all I could think of when I saw people filing into this room, that it's an immediate branding of who they are. So at the Piersall Detention Center, this is just a look at detentions over the years. We are at a record number of detentions right now. Detentions increased during the Obama years, but they are increasing at a more rapid pace now. And in this detention center, besides the male unit, which is very large, and the female unit, which is smaller, there is a segregated population called the trans unit. And so one of the groups of people that we met with were about 20 to 25 trans women. And they are separated because they can't be put in the women's section, and they dare not put them in the men's section. And so one of the women that I met with in this situation, whom I'll call Elena, 24-year-old trans woman from El Salvador. Imagine yourself trans in El Salvador. I mean, you might imagine yourself trans in the US, not good, but imagine yourself trans in El Salvador. And she explained to me that she was, at 15 years of age, started to present herself as more and more female. And when she did that, she was thrown out of the house because she was deemed to be a bad influence on the other siblings. And once out of the house and out, she was subject to violent attacks and other kinds of violence much of it gang related. She moved north through Mexico, worked for 3 months in a factory in Mexico, and eventually crossed over into the United States. So paradoxically, the segregation of the trans-only group in this detention center may have provided a strange kind of quasi-relief because she was actually saved, but not free. So, again, quoting Herman, in the absence of strong political movements for human rights, the active process of bearing witness inevitably gives way to the active process of forgetting. So in a sense, much of the work I think that we were doing was bearing witness.
I think in terms of bearing witness, I spoke earlier about that that's really a call that I think those of us who are Christians, and I think many traditions share that, that bearing witness, listening to stories, honoring the truth and complexity and horror of people and not minimizing it is part of that call. In terms of the tradition of the outcast or the stranger, there's a lot of rich material in that I found certainly in the Hebrew scriptures that Christians use about always those who are in exile or expanding the circle and the obligation to honor the stranger, the person who is alien and not welcomed, the absolute command to do that. I think that the Psalm 139 about being known, I've searched you out and known you, is one beautiful balm for this, because there's a way in which no matter what trauma you've gone through, your truest identity is at home in God, and that that can never be taken from you or given to you, that is just something that is true of all people. And that the idea that we have the welcome is also part of our Christian tradition, and that no one could be excluded from the table. There's a beautiful, unfortunately, that has happened in again, the humanness of our institutions. Some people have been excluded, but we are called again and again to return to welcome.
Maybe just as a way of wrapping up, I thought I would show you a picture of the staff at American Gateways. Now, these people actually look like they're having a good time, right? They are lawyers, and they are legal caseworkers, and they are support staff, and they are receptionists, and they are all manner of people. And actually very, very wonderful people who are like swimming upstream. And I was so impressed with their determination and their perseverance and their willingness to go on. And in the hallway of this organization, I saw this. And I whited out the names. Can you see?
Yeah.
And I commented on this and I said, this is interesting. How did you ever think about this? They said, oh, it's only been up for a week. And one of them found this on Instagram. Isn't that where we find everything? One of them found it on Instagram and copied it and made it. So all of these are magnetic, their names. And so every day they can move them. And you will notice that one of them says, I'm in a really dark place. And one person had put her magnet there. And someone had written with a marker, let us know if we can help. Which was very touching. So, bravo to those people. Thank you very much.
I resonate with the importance of listening to people's stories, but I also know that retelling a story can be re-traumatizing. And, I'd just like that to be addressed a little bit.
Thank you for that. I think that that is an enormously important contribution to this conversation. It's important both pastorally and clinically. And I would call it a matter of judgment. And I would say there's an axiom in social work that says start where the client is. And it is not the role of the priest, minister, rabbi, or imam to push a person to a place they're not, nor is it the role of the therapist. You take your cue from the person you're with, and people will let you know. One of the helpful things I find in terms of being a therapist is when you make a mistake, people let you know. So you ask a question they don't want to answer and they don't answer it, and that's that. You ask a question and they answer a different question, and that's that. So I don't think that there's horrific damage done by making a mistake, but it's really important for the pastoral worker as well as clinician to know it's not your job to get somebody from here to there.
I think a very important role is simply holding space for people to use however that they need it, and not imposing that. And that actually sometimes one of the powerful things that's happened to me a lot as a chaplain, and it happens in pastoral ministry too, is that sometimes the gift I give someone is to reject me. You know, you walk into a room as a chaplain and they say, get out, and you absolutely get out, right? I mean, they can't always say that to the person who's coming to draw their blood, or to the person. And I think that's true, that the power dynamic needs to be very much addressed, that the power is to the person who we are holding space for, and that we are there simply to listen as that's there, and also to absolutely take our direction from the person who's been traumatized.
Another question?
I actually have two comments. I worked in an emergency room for 18 years, and I've seen more dead bodies than most people see in 12 lifetimes. And I've dealt with families where they've lost someone. And I've seen all sorts of reactions, from calling a funeral home like you're making a business lunch, to people who had to be triaged and seen in the ER. And I learned, you know, just to go with wherever they were, as Mary just said, start where the client is. And what I learned was it's not so much what I said, it was how I said it. That's what they remembered. And there were times also when I worked with a chaplain, and we worked very well together, and that was very helpful. And the comment about Mary's presentation about forgetting, with all these traumas that are happening, you know, they're in the news, they're on TV, they're in papers, and there are vigils and then nothing. And what I'm starting to hear from some of the people who've been involved in these traumas is, you know, if nothing changes, nothing changes. And we can't just have vigils and say, well, I'm so sorry for your loss. It's not enough.
Hi, I want to thank you for focusing so much on the immigration and asylum-seeking crisis, because I think that it is the trauma that our society is facing most right now. I, in addition to my therapy work as just sort of a private person, I work with a volunteer organization visiting people who are detained at the Elizabeth Detention Center in New Jersey. And my comment and my question is that we're instructed as volunteers we're not therapists, we're not there in the role of therapists or lawyers or whatever we do professionally, we're there as friends. And yet, I have this training, and I have my own personal reactions, and it's really, really hard to contain, I'll say my feelings, but I think all of us who do this work, you know, the feelings that are evoked being there, and the desire to help and feeling so helpless is so strong. I wonder if you could just talk about the role of spirituality in that and self-care.
one of the things I wanted to mention is the importance of self-care. And I was at a pediatric institute training, and I found this really helpful years ago. That kind of listed what are the key spiritual needs that we have when we're undergoing any sort of stress, when we're present and witnessing to trauma or experiencing it ourselves. And kind of when we start to get to that point of burnout or feeling just flooded by helplessness, how do we get out of that? How do we become aware of places that can support us? And so what they did was they listed the key spiritual needs as the first is love, community, and connection. So affection, compassion, companionship, reconciliation. Where are the places that I can find love? Faith, philosophy, humility, finding the transcendent, awe, and I think wonder. So it would be love, faith, hope. Where do we find meaning, purpose, perspective? Where are those places? And return to that. Virtue, meaning integrity and ethics. Morality, kindness, patience, wisdom. Where do we see that? Who has that? Where are the places where we know that? And beauty, music, art, rest, meditation. So I just thought that was when we get to that place where we feel absolutely shut down and stuck, that we can think to ourselves, okay, let me think about community and connection. So love, community connection, faith, that wonder, hope, my vision, virtue. What are the integrity and ethics in me and in others who are doing this work? And beauty for renewal.
I would make one comment about that. One of the things I said to one of the people at American Gateways was, are volunteers really worth it? Because for any of you in organizations, volunteers are work. You have to do things with them. You have to orient them. You have to give them work. You have to stop their mistakes. I mean, there's all kinds of problems that volunteers bring. So I said, are volunteers really worth it? And she said, oh, yes. Oh, absolutely. Because we can't bear to continue to hear all these stories just ourselves. We can't bear it. And so if there's even 1 or 10 other people who will share that role of hearing the stories, it relieves us from hearing the stories. And I thought that was a very powerful, it's worth it.
Well, with that, we're going to bear those ideas in mind and take a little self-care right now for a little break. And we will come back in about 10 minutes for our next session. Thank you so much for